Well, we're back with a bit more of that American story. Now, I'm perfectly willing to admit that I'm prejudiced, but I honestly think that these dead people are much more alive than we might have thought. Might as well talk English on this show, even though we are going to talk about the Dutch. But let's get down to business. Last week we saw how, taking advantage of Spain's somewhat weakened condition, the impossibility in which she found herself to protect her American possessions, the English moved in. Now, other nations are going to trespass also, but the English are going to prove the most durable rivals of the Spaniards for the control of North America, but there will be the Dutch, the Swedes, and the French. Now, in the present discussion, we want to say something about the Dutch and the Swedes. Now, it's perfectly true that neither of them stay for very long on the North American continent, but nevertheless, their period here is of considerable importance, and for that reason, they deserve a bit of attention. Now, the story of the Dutch is one of the more fascinating, I think, in modern European history. This is a very enterprising people, a very interesting nation. It comes into being, or it achieves its independence at a relatively late date. During the Middle Ages, for example, the Dutch had consistently showed a mark or a characteristic of prosperity that would characterize few of the other countries. They were weavers, they were traders, and in general, they were able, because they were a town people to a very large extent, they were able to avoid being engulfed in the feudal system, which, as we know, was to a very large extent based upon land. However, the Dutch during the Middle Ages knew a number of overlords. Now they were dominated by the French, now they were dominated by one or other of the German states, of the Germanies, and toward the end of the 15th century, a series of circumstances prepared for a century of Spanish domination. The lord of most of the Netherlands at that time was Philip of Burgundy. And Philip of Burgundy was married to the eldest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Juana, the Mad, as she became known. The offspring of that union was the famous Charles V, Charles Habsburg. So that when, in the 16th century, Charles inherited his grandfather's lands in the Germanies, Austria, and various of the other German states, and then inherited his mother's lands, namely Spain and the New World, the Netherlands came under Spanish control. Now, in general, Charles, who had been born in the Netherlands and was a Fleming by birth, understood those people, got along very well with them. His son, Philip II of Spain, was a much more typical Spaniard and failed to understand these folk of Flanders and Holland and the various low country towns, and before very long there was serious friction between them. Now, this friction was aggravated by certain of the other developments that had taken place in Europe earlier in the 16th century. As we know, toward the end of the first quarter of that 16th century, there were a great number of religious disagreements in Europe, which ultimately developed into a number of new, or the so-called Protestant Christianities. Now, at first, Lutheranism had quite an appeal to the folk of the Netherlands, but a little bit later, when the Calvinist interpretation of Christian revelation came along, these people found that it was much more palatable, it fitted in much more with their religious ambitions, their work ambitions too, and they became quite enthusiastic Calvinists. Now, as the second half of the century moves along, Philip of Spain more or less puts himself up as the champion of the Catholic position. And one of the first things that he does is to try to clear any Protestantism out of the dominions over which he has control. He doesn't have too much difficulty in doing it in the Italian possessions of the Crown of Spain or in Spain itself. But he does run head-on into a great deal of opposition among the Dutch. And in the 1570s, the Dutch decide that they can't do business with their monarch, and they revolt, and as a result of that revolution, become an independent nation. Now, almost as soon as they become an independent nation, they join hands with the enemies of Spain and set out to do her as much hurt as possible. Philip, on the other hand, in order to punish them for their revolt, since he has now become the king of Portugal as well as the king of Spain, closes the Portuguese ports to the Dutch. Now, this is very serious, because Dutch prosperity, to a very large extent, up to this time, had been built up on the weaving trade, on the fishing trade, and on the carrying trade. In other words, the Dutch had the ships, and they would pick up the goods and transport them from place to place. And they had built up a great deal of their prosperity in becoming the distributors of the goods which the Portuguese brought into Lisbon from the Indies of the East. The Dutch would take them and distribute them to Northern Europe. Now, the port of Lisbon was closed to them, and they had to fight for their prosperity. Now, this put the Dutch more and more on the world market. They bypassed Lisbon. They didn't try to break through the Spanish prohibition at Lisbon. They went directly out to the east, and there challenged the Portuguese control of that empire, trading empire, dealing in spices and the eastern luxury goods, the eastern textiles, and so on and so forth. Now, this brought considerable ready wealth into the United Netherlands, as the country was called. And the Dutch burghers, the Dutch merchants, immediately jumped to take advantage of it. They found, or they decided early in the 17th century, in 1602 to be exact, that if they were to form into a union or into an association, they might be in a better position to exploit these opportunities. And so the Dutch East India Company was founded. Now, the Dutch East India Company not only became interested in running down the coast of Africa and across the Indian Ocean, but it also began to look around for other routes and other markets. And it is as an employ of the Dutch East India Company that in 1609, Henry Hudson, who, though he was an Englishman, sets out with a commission from this Dutch East India Company to find a new passage to the Indies of the East. At first he tried a northeast passage, and finding his way blocked, crossed the Atlantic and touched in along the Atlantic coast of North America. Now, he seems to have hit somewhat to the north of Chesapeake Bay, and to have run the coastline on up, and then he finds the mouth of a river, the river which subsequently bears his name, the Hudson. Now, he follows his little ship is one of the famous ships in American history. It's known as the Half Moon. So he sails the Half Moon up this river, the Hudson River, and gets as far as the modern area of Albany. Now, he doesn't stop. Let's put Albany up about here. He doesn't stop there, but he returns and tells of his experiences. He tells of what he had found. And the most notable thing that he had caught as he went along there was the possibility of the fur trade. Now, as I said, the Dutch merchants are always on the lookout to make a quick and an honest guilder, which was their unit of currency. So in 1610 and in subsequent years, a number of private expeditions come out to the Hudson Valley and begin to establish the fur trade with the Indians. Then in 1613, a group of these merchants band together and form what is known as the New Netherland Company. They obtain from the government of the Netherlands, the States General of the Netherlands, they obtain the right to engage in the fur trade in this area for a period of 5 years. And it proves quite profitable. In 1618, this same group, this New Netherland Company, applies for a renewal of their charter. But this renewal is denied them because there's a stronger pressure, stronger personalities are lobbying really to form a larger company which will not include include the Hudson Valley, but will have as its goal possibly the complete elimination of Portugal, certainly, and of Spain from the New World. However, the States General, the government of Holland at this time, or the government of the Netherlands, were not in a position to offend Spain. In 1609, they had agreed to a 12-year truce, which truce, obviously, would not be over until 1621. So they didn't want to charter a company whose avowed purpose was to war on Spain. However, they were much more favorable to the ideas of a certain individual, a man by the name of Uselings. Let me put that on the board because it's a peculiar name for you. They were much more interested in his ideas than in rechartering this other company. So as soon as the truce with Spain was over and Dutch hands, so to speak, were free, the government gave him permission to found the Dutch West India Company. Now, the Dutch West India Company begins to operate almost immediately. For example, within the next few years, the company sends out several expeditions, and these finally succeed in taking possession of the sugar plantation area of Brazil, the outer edge of the so-called bulge of Brazil. Now, the company also sets up trading bases, smuggling bases in the Caribbean, of which the island of Curacao is the most important. Curacao, well, we haven't got it on this map. It lies off the coast of Venezuela. Curacao today is much more important as an island upon which a good deal of the Venezuelan oil is refined before being shipped out to the world. And then also the third area that the company was interested in was the Hudson Valley. Now, it looked upon the Hudson Valley as a possible supplier of furs, wealth from furs, and then it also wanted the Hudson Valley to be an agricultural settlement so that it could furnish food not only to the mother country, but also furnish food to the planters in Brazil, the Dutch planters who had now taken over Brazil, and to the Dutch traders, the contrabandists or the smugglers who were establishing in several of the islands of the Caribbean. So therefore, the Hudson Valley is going to be a fur colony and an agricultural colony, at least on paper. Now, in 1623, the company sends out the first official group. See, up to that time, there had been small groups of Dutchmen up here at what they called Fort, this fort here on the Hudson at the mouth of the Mohawk, Orange. Then they had occupied at the mouth of the Hudson, Governor's Island. And then they had another post, Fort Nassau, down here in what is now New Jersey. This company group, when it comes out, decides to continue the two outpost settlements, Orange and Nassau, but shifts its center of activities at the mouth of the Hudson to Manhattan Island. And I think we all know the story of how the first governor, or the company governor, Peter Minuit, got together about 60 guilders worth, it might be about $24, $25 worth, of trinkets and gewgaws, looking glasses, beads, a few knives, a hatchet or two, and the Indians sold him Manhattan Island for that sum. Well, there's some people who think that we should give it back to the Indians, and others are very happy that he made the bargain. But at any rate, it was here that they decided to found the capital of the colony, which they called New Amsterdam. The whole colony, the whole Dutch enterprise in North America, is known as New Netherland, in the singular. Now, the Dutch enterprise, or the Dutch Empire here in North America, was going to prove ultimately a failure. It was going to last about 40 years. In 1664, the English would conquer it. But even though it's only a passing thing on the North American scene, it has its elements of importance. For example, one thing that the Dutch do is to open up the fur trade potential of this valley. And they make the first friendly contact with the Iroquois, who are going to be a very important factor at a later time in deciding which of the white groups, which of the European groups will control the North American continent. Now, they do, however, the Dutch have a considerable difficulty in peopling their colony. There are a number of reasons for that. And probably the most important reason is that Dutchmen had very little incentive to migrate. Remember last week when we were talking about the English, we said that one of the things which drew Englishmen, or encouraged Englishmen to take the risk, the gamble, and to come to North America was the fact that they couldn't get anywhere at home. Now, in Holland at this time, in the Netherlands at this time, there was great prosperity. So you don't pick up and leave when you have good times at home, and this was what Holland was enjoying. Now, in general, only very few Dutchmen came over. However, they had to pick up settlers from other groups. A certain number of Flemings, the people, the ancestors of one portion of the Belgians today, they came over. Walloons came over, also ancestors of the southern Belgians today. A certain number of Finns, people came in from some of the other areas. But the whole thing lacked a unity. There was not much loyalty toward Holland, and this showed very definitely in the day when the chips were down. When the English attacked, most of these people who had no particular loyalty to either the company or to the Estates General of Holland, they said, well, what difference does it make? If we maybe we can get along just as well, maybe better under English masters. Why should we fight for these Dutch who have treated us, more or less as stepchildren? Now, however, the colony did develop. It developed slowly. After New Amsterdam was 4 years old, there were no more than 270 inhabitants. Just figure that out. Figure what Manhattan Island supports today. And when it was 4 years old, they had a hard time getting, well, they didn't get up to 300 people. However, a number of the very interesting areas which we connect with New York City were already beginning to show. There was the Bowery, which at that time was largely a pasture land. There was the Battery, which was the place where the fort had been constructed. And to the north of the settlement, or in the outside of the settlement, there was a wall that protected the settled region of the island from possible attacks by the Indians and the like. This wall has subsequently been preserved in history as Wall Street. At least the name has been preserved. Now, little by little, the Dutch began to spread out. They spread up the river and spread over to Long Island, spread to Brooklyn, which in those days was Breukelein, and put little dots of settlement there. In general, their interest was in the development of agriculture. They grew quite a bit of wheat, and some of that they sent to the West Indies. Some of it they sent over to the mother country. They grew some rather good tobacco. The market for that was generally yet at home. You also had, and quite obviously, the great source of prosperity came from the prosecution or the activities of the fur trade. However, the company reserved a monopoly of the fur trade. The ordinary Dutch settler, the ordinary person in New Amsterdam or in Breukelein or in Yonkers and Poughkeepsie and so on, they could not get along in the fur trade. However, a very interesting society grew up, and even though the Dutch were quite strict in their religious affiliation, their religious devotion to Calvinism, they seem to have been able, what shall we say, to be a little bit more flexible than the folk up in Boston and in some of the New England colonies. The Dutch are basically a fun-loving people, and quite a number of our customs got something of a start in the New Netherland colony. Most of the snow and ice games, skating, coasting, tobogganing, and so on, was quite important there. The Dutch observed the Feast of St. Nicholas, out of which some of our Christmas tradition in connection with Santa Claus has developed. Their New Year's celebration, their New Year's celebration was rather interesting. It was the custom that on New Year's Day, New Year's Eve didn't mean so much, it was New Year's Day. After church service, it was the time when people went around to visit their friends. And it got to be pretty much of a liquid afternoon, because in each parlor that they went into, the rum was there, and after a certain time, they were pouring people back home. In the spring, they carried on the European tradition of the maypole. At Pentecost time, there was Pinkster Day, and this was a day of great jollification. Then their annual fair, their annual market, the kermesse, and so on, they were a fun-loving people. Now, there's not much need of saying a great deal about the governors. Few of them few of them even deserve mention. We might just say that for a time, there was an acting governor by the name of Kroll, C-R-O-L. And it was he who introduced the fried cake, which becomes the cruller and the granddaddy of the American donut. The most capable of their governors was Peter Stuyvesant, the last of the governors. Stuyvesant had come up from the from the Caribbean, and it was his job to try to put some order in this colony. Now, they didn't like him particularly, but he was a good administrator. After he got a fair amount of order around New Amsterdam, he decided that his next job was to displace the Swedes. Now, the Swedes, from the late 30s forward, had been on the Delaware. They had established several small settlements along the Delaware, and they were trying to muscle into the fur trade, and the Dutch figured that they were in their way. So in 55, 1800 or 1655, the Swedes were displaced. The Swedes have one very colorful character as a governor during a period of 10 years, and this is a tremendous man, John Prince. He weighed something upwards of 300 pounds, and the Indians took one look at him and tabbed him big guts, and that he remained as long as he was around. But the Swedes are eliminated by the Dutch, and the Dutch are ultimately eliminated by the English, and the way is prepared for the emergence of the middle colonies: New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and so on. Let's take a quick look at a couple things that you might be interested in reading. The first volume of this History of New York deals with the Dutch days. The editor is A.C. Flick. There's a rather old book, rather chatty and pleasant, by Thomas Janvier, The Dutch Founding of New York. A lot of the old folk customs are preserved therein, and so on. A somewhat different picture of the whole colony, with emphasis on the spirit of the people, the makeup of society, is Ellis Raisley, The Portrait of New Netherland. In this Chronicles of America series, there is one of the volumes that's pertinent, The Dutch and the English on the Hudson. At least the first portion of the book will tell you of the Dutch. Then, an account of the Dutch and the Swedes on the Delaware is Christopher Ward's book by that name, The Dutch and the Swedes on the Delaware. Now, we've caught the Dutch. They haven't stayed long. In our next, we'll catch the French. And the French are going to stay around much longer, even though they too ultimately will be eliminated. So until next week, don't work too hard.
The preceding program was distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is National Educational Television.